مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. بقي في منصبه فترة أطول من أي جمهوري في التاريخ بطريقة ما. يعد من أكثر المتحزبين في واشنطن، ويكرهه ملايين الأميركيين بسبب ما فعله للمحكمة العليا بجعلها مؤسسة محافظة. ولكن من جهة أخرى هو مؤمن بأفكار رونالد ريغان، وهو الرئيس الذي قاد البلاد في فترة كان زعماء الحزبين يجتمعون بهدوء لحل المشاكل من أجل الصالح العام. وعندما أعلن عن نعطيه في التقاعد، شكل إعلانه نهاية فترة مهمة في عالم السياسة تمثل في أهميتها تقاعد مايكل جوردن من كرة السلة للمحترفين. هذا الرجل هو ميتش ماكونيل، الزعيم القوي للجمهوريين في مجلس الشيوخ من ولاية كنتاكي، ولبحث دوره في السياسة الأمريكية وكيف غيرت السياسة الأمريكية من دوره فيها. يسرني أن أستضيف نخبة من الخبراء السياسيين أنا جيراتيلي، أليكس بولتون ودانيال ليبمان. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. We've had big news in American politics, sometimes with elections, sometimes with announcements of people running for office, and sometimes with people deciding it's time to bow out. We've had one of those big bow out announcements. Mitch McConnell, the Senate leader of the Republican Party, the longest serving Senate leader of the Republican Party, saying he's calling it quits at the end of this year. All right, let's look at what this means and put it in the context of our presidential election with Alexander Bolton, Anna Giratelli, and Daniel Lippman. Thank you all for joining us. So, Alex, who is Mitch McConnell and why does he matter?
Well, Mitch McConnell matters because he's been the Senate Republican leader for more than 17 years. He was elected back in 1984. His wife served as Secretary of Labor, Secretary of Transportation under the Bush and Trump administrations. He has been very influential in recruiting Senate candidates. And of course, his biggest career mark is holding the Antonin Scalia vacancy on the Supreme Court open during the final year of President Obama's presidency so that Donald Trump could appoint 3 conservative justices to the Supreme Court. Of course, let's not forget that when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died in late 2020, right before the presidential election, McConnell speedily confirmed Amy Coney Barrett to the High Court. So he, if you ask him, he says his biggest legacy and his biggest accomplishment is shaping the Supreme Court, which is going to have an impact on American jurisprudence and policy and politics, really for years, if not decades to come. But he has a long record in Washington, and he really has been I would say the most, powerful Republican in Congress, going back to 2009, when Republicans, after the 2008 election, had only won 41 seats in the Senate. There was a huge Democratic majority in the House. John McCain got smoked in the 2008 election. So he really led the Republican comeback to power. And of course, now he's being supplanted by a new Republican leader, a new leader of the party, and that's Donald Trump.
Okay, so we'll get to that. And I want to ask you, Daniel, what is the relationship between the man who reigned in the Senate for 17 years and the leader of the Republican Party, Donald Trump?
Well, it was always kind of frosty because McConnell represented the old school establishment Republican Party, kind of a country club, businessman heavy party full of lawyers and people who really cared about low taxes and free trade and engagement with the world. And this new Republican Party led by Donald Trump is much more isolationist, much more anti-free trade, skeptical of immigration. And so they have really clashed in the last few years. McConnell was the good soldier and worked with Trump a lot, but their relationship broke a few years ago and they haven't talked since, especially after Trump blasted McConnell's wife, Elaine Chao, his former transportation secretary using racist names against her. Of course, McConnell is not going to like that.
And this is because she resigned immediately after January 6th, if I remember. Is that correct?
She did. She was one of a number of Trump officials who could not stand to continue with Trump after what happened during those Capitol riots.
And Anna, on a key issue in American politics, the southern border, immigration, how would you define Mitch McConnell's record on this? And has he worked with Donald Trump, who's made it such a key feature of his campaigns, or has it not been as central to who Mitch McConnell is?
Yeah, I think he'd certainly say, Mr. McConnell, he has worked with President Trump during his 4 years. The last few years, the Democrats have had control of the Senate. We haven't seen any legislation come through. During 2013, we had the Gang of Eight that immigration reform failed to come through. And right now, the House has passed H.R. 2 last year and waited for the Senate to move on it. Granted, Democrats are in control of the Senate, but there hasn't been a push to bring that up. We saw the recent border deal in the Senate failed to get any brought to the floor of the Senate. So I think, Mitch McConnell's departure from the Senate, will be an interesting chance for Republicans, especially if they take back the Senate in November, to coalesce and maybe unite with moderates in the House, moderate Republicans, and see if, what can be done working with Democrats on immigration.
So, Alex, before we move a bit from Mitch McConnell, I need to ask you about an oddity of American politics. How does one state, the Commonwealth of Kentucky, send to the Senate two people with such diametrically opposed visions of America's role in the world? You have Mitch McConnell, a valiant supporter of Ukraine, an internationalist, believes in American leadership abroad, and Rand Paul, an isolationist, opposed to foreign aid, opposes supporting Ukraine.
Well, I think it's the answer is the times that when they were elected, and it's almost like it's like one of those the scientists will drill run a drill through a tree and pull out the plug with all the different rings and kind of go back in time. We're sort of seeing a core sample right here of Republican politics when you compare Mitch McConnell and Rand Paul. Mitch McConnell elected in 1984 when Democrats still were dominant in the South. He, in fact, beat a Democratic incumbent to be elected to the Senate. Ronald Reagan, the big internationalist, was the most prominent Republican in Washington. Fast forward to 2010 when Rand Paul was elected. That's when the Tea Party was ascendant. And of course, Mitch McConnell did not support Rand Paul's candidacy for the Senate initially. Rand Paul defeated Mitch McConnell's favored candidate in a Tea Party upset. So really what it is, their snapshots, their elections are snapshots of two different points in time, and we're seeing the evolution of the Republican Party. The reason they both stuck around, or McConnell stuck around so long, is the power of incumbency is very powerful. And if once you're in office, it's tough to get you out, especially if you're from a solidly Republican or Democratic state. So, there are two different, Republican constituencies in Kentucky. There's more of the country club business constituency, as Daniel alluded to, and then there's more of the Tea Party, libertarian and kind of populist conservative constituency. And those two senators kind of serve similar constituencies. It'll be interesting to see who replaces Mitch McConnell at the end of 2026 when his term expires. I expect it's probably a Republican more in the mold of Rand Paul than Mitch McConnell comes to the Senate next from Kentucky.
All right, well, we're going to ask Daniel about that right now. And Daniel, in Washington, people don't wait for funerals to fight over the spoils. We're already having a pretty active race to succeed Mitch McConnell to become the next Republican leader of the Senate. Can you tell us a bit about this?
So you have, I would say the top candidate is John Cornyn, who is a senator from Texas, has long been in Republican leadership, is pretty moderate. And the other person who is really eyeing this that I would keep my eye on is John Thune from South Dakota. very handsome member of the Senate, kind of fits the part. And he, they both are veteran politicians. They know how the Senate works. There's a lot of rules that go into it. And so it'll be interesting to see if Trump weighs in, whether he endorses any of them. And also, you have another guy, John Barrasso from Wyoming, who has, considered that post. So it's the three Johns who are kind of leading the way for leadership of the Senate for the first, the one or two slots. And so that's kind of not a very diverse set of folks at the top.
And are there significant policy differences, Anna? Do we know about any significant policy differences among the candidates here?
John Cornyn's really been more of a centrist Republican. He actually led on the gun reform after the Uvalde shooting. He'd also tried to work on immigration reform. It's one reason that here in Texas, so many conservatives further right in the spectrum have really been upset at the idea of John Cornyn possibly moving forward to take over for McConnell. They don't see him as being far enough to the right as they would prefer.
It does say a bit about the Republican Party that John Cornyn is now a moderate in this party. And when does all this happen, Alex? What is the process? It's not nearly as open as a presidential election, for example.
No, not at all. It's going to be a closed door election. The ballots are going to be secret ballots, so we won't even know who voted for whom. And the ballots don't get cast until after the general election in November. So we're probably looking at mid-November for the Republicans to gather in the old Senate chamber and cast the secret ballots. And we're going to gather only two candidates. If there were three, they cast the first round of ballots. The lowest vote getter gets kicked out, and then they cast another round. But right now, it looks like it's going to be a two-person race, and we're going to have an interesting. So we're going to see some interesting jockeying over the next 8 months between Thune and Cornyn. I thought it was interesting that Daniel thinks that Cornyn is the front runner. I've heard other Democrats say that. I've heard other Republicans. I've heard Republican senators cast Thune as the front runner, but because it's a secret process, it's really hard to know who's on top.
And just before the break, you mentioned him in passing, the Donald Trump. Is he going to play any role in this? I suppose if it's after the election, if he's the victor, he may have a big role to play.
Well, that's a good question. And typically, presidents don't play a big impact because the senators prize their independence, and they don't want to be seen as kind of the lapdogs of the incoming president. But certainly, if President Trump does win the White House and he comes out very strongly against one of the candidates, let's say it's Thune or let's say it's Cornyn, then that would really hurt that candidate's I think position and chances of winning, because after the years of tension and awkwardness between McConnell and Trump, Republican senators really want to put that behind them. They want a leader who can work with the new Republican president, and both Thune and Cornyn right now are really tripping over themselves to proclaim themselves as people who have worked with Trump in the past and can do so again in the future.
Before we go to a different topic after the break, prognostications, who's going to win this little internal vote on the Senate? Daniel Lippman.
Well, I actually, I think John Thune, he's kind of more of the future of the Republican Party. He's much younger than Cornyn, and so he could, if he gets this, reign for many years at the top of the Senate GOP.
Okay, well, we're going to remember that coming back at the end of the year to see if you're right. All right, after the break, we're going to take a look at some of the issues and races that were not national races, but races with national implications that we had here in the United States during our big primary day called Super Tuesday, in just a moment. Again, my guests today include Anna Giratelli. Anna is the Immigration and Homeland Security reporter for the Washington Examiner, where she has reported previously and extensively from America's southern border. She's also reported for CQ Roll Call, Yahoo News, and The Oregonian. Also joining us is Alexandra Bolton. Alex is senior staff writer at The Hill, a newspaper offering in-depth reporting on the politics and policy in our national legislature, where he covers Congress and the broader American political scene. And with us is Daniel Lippman. Daniel covers Washington politics for Politico, where he also authors the social data section of Politico's New York Playbook. Previously, he was a reporter with the Wall Street Journal in New York. All right, we recently had Super Tuesday, a big primary election day here in the United States. It was pretty boring on the presidential front. We saw Donald Trump and Joe Biden rack up a series of victories, but it did make some important news in key congressional and Senate races that have a big impact in our national politics. Let's take a quick look at that with our panelists. The marquee race in the United States Senate was for an open seat in California, which is always a national trendsetter. Alex, could you tell us a bit what happened in the Senate California race?
Well, the big development there is that Adam Schiff, the Democratic congressman, and Steve Garvey, the Republican candidate and former star baseball player, have advanced to the general election. And so California is different from other states that you don't have just the top vote getter of one party and the top vote getter of another party automatically advancing, but it's a jungle primary, so where you have the top two candidates of any party advancing. And so there was speculation that the general election might be between two Democrats, Adam Schiff and Katie Porter. And Schiff is more of the centrist, but with a bigger national name ID. Porter is more of the liberal and might have more grassroots support. But I think the surprise there is that Steve Garvey, the famous baseball player who was a big star back in his day, he got 400,000 votes more than Porter did. He really swamped her, and now he's heading to the general with Schiff. And so what's significant here is that it means that Porter's not going to be in the Senate, but also it means that, and I think some Republicans are going to try to drum up some, hype here that, this might be a, somewhat competitive race, although I doubt it. For me, the bottom line takeaway is that Adam Schiff is likely to be the next senator from California, and I think he is going to be a great addition to the Senate. He's a brilliant lawyer, and his performance during the impeachment trial, he had a pretty weak case, but he argued one hell of a case, and he's got some real intellect and star power. So I think that is going to be a good match for a big important state like California.
Daniel, California is often a trendsetter for the nation in some respects. Did we learn anything from this race that has implications beyond the borders of California?
I think we learned something in terms of how California's cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco have struggled with homelessness and crime. And that has been a good issue for Republicans to say, hey, we're in this big blue state run by big city mayors from the Democratic Party and a governor in California, Gavin Newsom, and yet they can't keep the streets clean. There is feces sometimes in San Francisco. A lot of people left that city. And so that was one reason that I think Steve Garvey came out in the number 2 position, and Republicans are hoping that is a good trend for November, that they can beat Democrats in some of those suburban districts in New York, some of those swing districts that border cities where people live in the suburbs, work in the cities, and they don't like the governance, especially with many migrants who have been bused to blue cities.
So, Anna, actually, as just to pick up on this theme, border issues are not just for border districts. I mean, if you're trying to make this a national issue, Republicans are have various efforts to try to turn this into a national political issue. How do you see that process playing out?
Yeah, I don't think Republicans even need to try to turn it into a national issue. It's become one on its own. At the southern border, you've got 2,000 miles. 60% of that distance is taken up by Texas, and then there's Arizona, California, New Mexico. Early on in the Biden administration, when we saw the border crisis begin, we saw almost 70% of all illegal immigrant arrests at the southern border occurring in Texas. Now, as Governor Greg Abbott of Texas has really put up concertina wires, set his National Guard down to the border by the thousands, sent state troopers, passed laws to make it more offensive to come over the border, for state police to be able to arrest immigrants and such. All these measures in that 3 years, federal data now shows that the percentage of immigrants arrested coming into Texas is almost down to 30%. Immigrants are choosing far and wide to cross into Tucson, Arizona, and San Diego, California. So we're really seeing the shift, and that in turn is going to impact those states. San Diego saying that migrants are released at bus stops every day by the hundreds. The nonprofits are overwhelmed. And then migrants are told that, these cities are going to take care of us. They may not understand what a sanctuary city actually is. And so between now and November, I think we're going to continue to see immigration and the border issue play an even greater, take up a greater part of people's minds as they're heading to the polls.
All right. Alex, in the House, Republicans currently hold the slimmest of majorities. Did anything happen in the primary elections that could have an impact come November and help determine the fate of that House of Congress?
Well, I think, just continuing the conversation about California, New York Times had a piece out talking about how control of the House in 2024 may come down to California and how well Republicans do in some of these swing districts in California. And the fact that you had such a strong showing by Steve Garvey, I mean, that could be good news for Republicans in some House districts in California. But around Houston, where Sheila Jackson Lee held off a challenger, Amanda Edwards, despite getting really outspent, and Sheila Jackson Lee ran for mayor and got crushed and looked like she was weak and that it might be the end of her 30-year career. But she held off the challenger, and that's kind of big news because Sheila Jackson Lee is a pretty prominent personality here on Capitol Hill. But that is a safe, Democratic seat anyway. I'm sure there's more to be read in the tea leaves looking at the various primary results, but that's what I'm focused on right now.
And Daniel, when you look at Super Tuesday and its impact beneath the presidential election, what's your impression on the results that we have?
Well, we didn't see any major upsets of sitting members of Congress. There was one battle between two sitting members because there was redistricting, but we did not see any major figures like Eric Cantor back a decade ago, Joe Crowley, who were major figures on Capitol Hill, go down. And so I think that what's interesting about these primaries is that you only have 8% of Americans who really vote in them. And so they usually determine who's going to represent many Americans, because not many people show up. A lot of people are discontent with the Democratic and Republican parties. They want a third party. They want less polarization. And so a lot of people have kind of given up.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Daniel Lippman, Alex Bolton, Anna Girardelli, for helping to explain the intricacies of our primary elections and the potential long-term implications for our November election and what happens when we have a new president after that vote. Thank you very much for joining us this week on داخل واشنطن. إلى هنا تنتهي هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كانت لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات وخاصة حول تناقش التأييد للزعامة أمريكا في العالم بين أعداء الحزب الجمهوري اليوم، أرجو التواصل معي على تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو الكتابة إلي مباشرة @RobSatloff. وحتى نلتقي في الأسبوع المقبل، شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.